Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Table Talk. I'm your host, Jake Combs. Tonight we're going to be doing a little bit of painting of the house side of the Skies of Fire box set. And before we get started on that, we're actually going to unbox the Corvus Cabal warband from WarCry. So this is one of the core warbands that came out at launch, and we're just now getting a hold of our copy of it. Now, from what I have understand from people who have played them, that a lot of the time these ones pretty much dominate the sky and the upper levels of the 8 points. The Shrike Talon himself on stilts with wings definitely can be quite deadly from what I've heard. And the folks at my local shop have actually suggested painting him to look like a flamingo because of the stilts. And while I mostly wanted to, when I do get around to painting them, I do wanted to do them as a whole, similar to the actual box art. Now, the idea of doing the Shrike Talon as a flamingo sounds hilarious and awesome. So I'm very tempted to do that. So we'll see what happens when I actually get around to building them and how I'm feeling at the time. Now, we have our instruction booklet. Everything's the standard, color spread where it shows in blue the pieces that are being added on, so that way things make more sense. And that way parts are easier to identify. I do see a couple of the characters do have some exchangeable weapons, like the Cabalist. It can be just regular Cabalist or a Cabalist with spear. I'm thinking probably going with spear. Then there's one with a familiar, where you can go with the familiar or with a spear. And with him, I know I'm definitely going to go with the familiar. Not sure what the familiar does yet, but it just looks freaking awesome. And what's interesting is the one with the familiar does have, actually that's a completely different guy. Okay, so on the box they actually did him with the spear instead. So definitely very cool, and I love the color guide for how they did certain colors. Definitely will be quite helpful. I do hope that in the future, though, since this release was about the same time as the contrast paints, that when they do this, they basically do an alternate version of with contrast. So for those that use predominantly contrast paints, can get an idea for what colors are going to work best. Now, taking a look at the first of 2 sprues. Not a lot going on there as far as numbers, but this will make up, looks like 9 models total, including the Shrike Talon. It looks like we got 3 right here, and then the other 6 over here, including the Shrike Talon. The details on all of them, fantastic. I love the style of the warband with all of the feathers and the wings and their kind of iconography. And in the WarCry anthology book, their story was by far one of the best, and absolutely loved it. So definitely looking forward to giving these guys a try, and we're hoping to see more of the warbands in the near future. Alright, so now it's time to paint. So things are going to be pretty simple for tonight. We're just taking our 5 ships, and we're pretty much going to cover them pretty much entirely in let's see, one of the reds. I think we're gonna go with Blood Angels Red. I don't want them to look like as much of a blood red, so I'm avoiding the Flesh Terrors Red, which Flesh Terror Red is my favorite red to paint with usually, just because of that deep, rich, blood-like color that you get from it. Other than the fact that it's not a technical paint in that the way it works with Blood for the Blood God, if you want something that looks very bloody, it works great. And especially since I'm actually in the process of working on my Blackstone Fortress, there's going to be a lot of Chaos Cultists, and I'm going to be doing their paint scheme after the Blood Pact from the Gaunt's Ghost books. And so that Flesh Terrors Red is going to come in real handy with that. So that way you're not just using a bunch of Blood for the Blood God, but you're still getting a very rich color with it. All right. So the main thing that I like to do when I'm painting the ships is I do one ship at a time, do the top coat, move on to the next one, and then that way by the time I'm back to the beginning, the top coat's already dry. I flip it over, do the bottom coat, and then do the rest of them in that same fashion. And then, like we mentioned last week, you want to make sure that you shake up your contrast paint quite a bit, because you want to make sure you're getting all that pigment up. And like I was also saying last week, I do plan on investing in an agitator in the near future, so that way we can definitely get that pigment really well shaken, especially for the metallics, because a lot of the medium and the metallics separate quite a bit, so you do kind of need all of that to have a very good effect. Now, one thing that you want to make sure that you're doing is whenever you're doing with contrast paint, you go over all the details quite a bit, because you want it to soak in all that ink. Or normally with your paints, you wouldn't want to do this, because most of the paints are thick enough that it's going to actually fill those gaps. But the contrast paint instead, it's basically leaving you a wash in those details instead. And one thing I do plan on doing in the near future as well with the Corvus Cabal is I've always been a Chaos player, whether it's 40k or Fantasy, more than really any other faction. And so because of that, and because of my love for WarCry, I'm actually going to be doing a WarCry based army, and I'm actually going to be using the list created by the Warhammer community team, and so the Corvus Cabal are going to be a big part of that. Now I already have 2 of the chariots. I do need to get 1 more for the army, but before I do want to get some extra unmade members. I actually don't have any models from the unmade yet, but I am planning on doing one of the chariots being pulled by 2 of the unmade and having their champion riding in the chariot, basically goading them on, possibly using some bits from the Splintered Fang, predominantly that really long whip, having that champion driving the chariot with it. So definitely some cool stuff in the works, but as anyone that's been in this hobby for a long time can tell you, this hobby is not cheap. And so when you're relying on your own resources for those kinds of things, it will take a good little while to get everything that you want. But if you're patient and you save, you can definitely afford those things eventually. And also one thing too is I do see a lot of people get upset over the general cost of the hobby, and I do understand that it is a very expensive hobby, especially if you're like me and that you don't want to play with something that's not painted. So you definitely want to make sure you go through and do that as much as possible. But you also want to plan out your army well ahead of time before you make financial leaps. So a lot of times what I like to do is I'll use proxies in my force, because just like most of you out there, I have a huge backlog of models to paint. And so because of that, I'll use those gray plastic models to represent the units that I actually want to add to my force. And because I was distracted talking, I started working on the bottom already, so I'm going to actually set this guy on my palette so that way it doesn't get any paint on the table while we start working on the second ship. And then anytime you're using contrast paints, don't be afraid to really get it everywhere, because you want as much paint to soak into those recesses. Pretty sure I screwed that up the first time. And so that extra shade getting in there is really going to help it pop. And then on top of that, a lot of times when contrast paint dries, it does pull a little bit away from the edges. So you will have to typically do some touch-ups. So any of you out there got plans for Memorial Day? Planning on doing some painting or building your new army? I know I'm going to be working on my Blackstone Fortress. I'm working on the heroes at the moment. I'm actually doing a big push for 40K stuff right now as far as painting goes to get Blackstone Fortress completely done. As far as what we have so far, there are, including the one that just released, the final expansion, there's 3 expansions we don't have. The one that includes the Zote, the Plague Marines, and then the new one that includes the giant drones. Now, I know I mentioned last week that I know very little about the different Tau groups. And so if any of you out there know much about Tau lore, I would really appreciate it if you could identify some of the Tau armies that predominantly use red. I know I've seen some of the painted pieces that, most of them are mostly whites. There's some gold and yellows, and then there's one particular command model that I remember seeing that used a lot of red. And so that's actually part of why I chose red for this army. And as I've mentioned, I don't know a lot about their lore. I do know that while I was mostly playing Necromundas when they were first introduced to 40k, but I didn't get their codex and read up on them. It was always one of those armies that I wanted to get to eventually, because their mechanized units are very awesome in appearance. And one thing you also want to do using contrast paints, if you're planning on covering pretty much every inch in one base color, you want to make sure that you are definitely using a lot of the paint, again, to fill every recess, but also you want to make sure that you're using a brush that you don't really care much about, because doing that kind of method of painting, you typically get paint pretty much all over everything, and you want to make sure that that's really what you're doing. And having a brush you don't care about can definitely speed this process up, because you're able to just quickly throw it on, coat everything. Alright, one more ship left to do. This is for the top coat. now looking at this piece and how it's drying, I'm definitely very happy with this red. And for those just tuning in, I'm covering this in Blood Angels contrast paint, or Blood Angels red rather, from the contrast paint line. All right, so the first ship is done being coated. Okay. So we got the two big ships done. So now we're starting on our little ones. Those of you that are playing Aeronautica, what factions are you playing? I know technically we only have 3, 4 real factions: Tau, Orcs, Astra Militarum, and Imperium of Man. But those last two, personally, I consider them the same army. All right. All right, one more to go, and then we'll be done painting for the evening. Almost done. And then I know last week we talked about the fact that GamesU was looking at possibly opening its doors to start up for gaming and using the signatures and everything like that to protect themselves. But the visited the shop recently and found that that has been postponed. Currently no set date. The problem is a lot of the people in our local community are refusing to wear masks, even though the stores themselves are getting fined if they do. And GamesU has been real good about making sure that no one comes in without wearing a mask. But just too many people in the community are still arguing over the topic. And so they're not willing to reopen, while so many members of the community disagree with it. And so until then, it's not going to be available for everyone. Which makes sense, because they got to protect not only themselves, but their employees, their customers, and make sure that they can recover from anything that goes wrong if that happens. So it makes perfect sense. All right, so we're all squared away there. That's it for tonight. Thank you guys for watching, and we'll be back next week where we're going to actually be doing some washes, do some black detailing as well, with some Black Templar contrast paint, and then depending on how quickly that goes, may even do some highlights when we're done. But again, that's it for tonight. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll catch you all next week. Good night.